Welcome to Peninsula Seniors Lecture Series. Sit back, get comfortable, and let's go see what they have for us today.
All right, good morning once again, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another of the Peninsula Seniors Wednesday morning lecture programs. We're indeed fortunate today to have a member of the Peninsula community who's been active locally for many, many years in the city of Rolling Hills. Our speaker has been a councilman and mayor in Rolling Hills and has made a significant place for himself as an atmospheric physicist, a rather unusual occupation. In addition to his work in the aerospace industry, our speaker developed the world's first manned superpressure lighter-than-air vehicle, which is a big word for balloon. What's most intriguing is the fact that that balloon, called Atmosat, was launched from the City Hall of Rancho Palos Verdes many, 30-odd years ago, and established a unique record during that flight. And so, ladies and gentlemen, join me in welcoming Tom Heinsheimer of Rolling Hills.
Well, thank you very much. What I thought I'd do is talk a little bit about ballooning in Palos Verdes and how we got started. I really should have started with a picture, talk about going back to the beginning, of myself and Fred Hess, because I served with Fred on the Rolling Hills City Council at the very beginning, and of course he was instrumental in SOC and in getting this city formed, and he was there for some of the very earliest balloon adventures. This intro picture is our Atmosat balloon flying over at that time, a bit less populated Palos Verdes. So if you see any of your houses or any vacant lots that became your houses later on, you won't be surprised. The balloon itself is a shiny silver sphere, as you can see, something that's very different than the normal balloons that you see. And we call it superpressure because it's sealed up. It doesn't have an escape valve, so it flies under pressure, which is why all of the people who did that before were killed. So we were the first people to actually have flown a superpressure balloon and lived to tell the tale. Next chart will show how we came about it. And we started with a really, really bad idea. And the idea was, one day I got a call from Malcolm Forbes. And Forbes had the idea of wanting to cross the Atlantic in a balloon. And this was in the mid-'70s when it hadn't yet been done. And the idea was to put together a number of these superpressure balloons in a cluster, which was putting together, it was adding, as it turned out, a stupidity on top of stupidity, because nobody had ever flown a single superpressure balloon. Clusters of balloons are even more complex. But he had a lot of money and a lot of enthusiasm, and with money and enthusiasm, foolhardy efforts are often born. So this was the idea, this was the sketch, and this was the trajectory that we were going to fly as seen by the weather people a couple of days before the flight. The idea was to launch from California. Why? Because we live here, and fly across the United States, and then fly across the Atlantic and land in Paris, and Lindbergh style, and it would all be terrific. Okay, so let's see how this turned out. It was called the Atlantic Project, as you can see. This is the gondola, and the gondola had been put together at a number of factories here in Los Angeles, and then we went out to the dirigible hangars in order to put it all together, because the dirigible hangar, being a very large structure, was something we needed for all the balloons. So you can see all these electronics and all the gizmos up there for satellite communications, and we were going to live, Malcolm and I were going to live inside this sphere for a week as we floated across the Atlantic to a heroic landing in Paris. Here is Malcolm and myself, and if you look at that picture, I'm going to do what? What is it we're really going to do? But you get into this situation where you can't back out. What are you going to do? Well, these people here. So here we are in the hangar at Tustin, and now you see two pictures here, taken, one from the ground looking up and one from the girders looking down at the cluster of balloons all being put together. All of these were sealed balloons. Each one of them had to have exactly the right amount of gas put in so that when they got up to 40,000 feet, they would inflate and they would be perfectly pressurized. Everything had to be perfect. Well, nothing's perfect. This is you can see the scale of the activity by the crowd down here. And this is about 4 o'clock in the morning in January in 1975. It's freezing cold. So it was fabulous theater. It was one of these things with Forbes, you had everybody out there taking pictures and videos, and then the big doors of the hangar open, and we had these giant spotlights, something. It was fabulous. Unless you were inside the gondola, which was only Malcolm and myself, and he didn't understand the problem. So everybody thought it was wonderful. Now what happens is we were able to inflate and put the balloons up like this. So you see there's a top balloon, 13 balloons as it turned out. That's also nice. And then a cluster of three, cluster of three, cluster of three. And then they got to this point, and they suddenly realized that the carts that were holding these things just weren't strong enough to do the job, and they couldn't launch anymore to get this one in position. The gondola, this little dot right down there, that's the gondola. And inside the gondola is Malcolm Forbes and myself. And of course, I was happy to have Malcolm on board because I knew that if we went down in the Atlantic, they'd never stop looking for him. And then all of a sudden, there was sort of a crack and a grind, and everything started shaking around. And the launch director pulled the emergency release, and the balloons went flying off into the sky, and the gondola was left sitting here. So we had made a transatlantic flight, which went about as far as from here to that camera. And of course, I was delighted because we were actually alive, which was nice and unexpected, because had the balloons gone up a little bit, probably would have ended badly. We recovered the balloons. They went shooting up, popped, and came back down again, and we found them out in the Borrego Desert. And the gondola was just sitting here. Everything was in good shape. I was happy that I had briefed the fireman before, telling him, if anything happens, don't come in with a fire axe, hacking away to get us out, because it looks like a real solid thing, but it's only a very thin aluminum, and our noses are on the other side. So when we got out, I was happy, but I noticed then that we had delayed so long that the fire people had changed shifts. And of course, the next guy didn't know anything about it, but he wasn't very interested about coming in with an axe anyway. This is the after effect. This is the briefing to the press on what happened. And, Malcolm's certainly keeping a stiff upper lip, and I'm trying to tell the tale. Our son Eric, who's now 40-something, at that time was a little guy, and I had told him just before I got into the gondola, I said, as we say to everybody when you're about to do this, I'll see you in Paris. And so then when the thing crashes and burns and everything's chaotic and the balloons are flying away, and we climb out of this thing, and he runs over and jumps into my arms, and I'm holding him, and he doesn't say, Dad, I'm glad you're alive, or I was scared, and none of that. He says, can we go to Paris anyway? And of course that's exactly what we did. So there's Eric right there. Now, having failed to fly 13 superpressure balloons across the Atlantic from California, we decided a much more modest step would, how about if we built one that would actually work? And so with the cooperation of the RPV City Council, we got, as you probably will recognize, the site over at the what was then the Nike site. You will remember that we used to have ballistic missiles, cruise missiles and things. Some of those missiles were installed over at the Nike site, and when the missiles came out, the site was perfect for us. And so we designed and built a balloon which we stored over there in the warhead facility that was used for years and years when it was a Nike site. And this is the balloon coming out for the first time. We laid it out right on top of the launch base where it used to be the missiles were underneath, and they'd come up and they'd fire them off. The missiles are gone, but the launch base, actually, it's still there today. I was over there last week, and it looks exactly the same. And so here's Eric. You have to put your children to work to learn a trade. And so this is Eric learning how to fill sandbags. And the idea is you fill them until you can't lift them anymore, and then it's about right, and put them on the cart and haul them off. Here we are inflating the balloon first time. Here's the balloon getting more and more inflated. There's my wife, Julie. And you see this is the base here, made for a nice flat area. There's the balloon being inflated. Very unusual looking balloon. There was no other balloon looking like that in the world. And this is what it looks like when it's inflated and pressurized. So you can see the reflection of the sky and of the ground, and it's just a large silver Christmas tree ornament that's exactly 10 meters in diameter. You have helium in there? Yes, we have helium in there, right. We fly hydrogen when we're flying sport balloon in Europe, and we fly helium in this. So here we are getting ready to launch. There's my daughter Eden, who is now a larger person, wife Julie, and myself, Pete Nuschel, who is also a PV resident, Dr. George, who was doing our weather forecasting, and you can see we had a nice classical, we had a very modern, ultra-modern balloon and a classical wicker basket. So we're trying to match 200 years of technology into one thing. And then we actually took off. Now this, you might say, well, it's not a big deal. Well, after the Atlantic project, this was a very big deal. We had gone about 100 times further than, when this picture was taken, we'd flown 100 times further than we did with Malcolm Forbes' investment of $1 million in trying to fly across the Atlantic. So we felt pretty good. Of course, you still had to come down. So this is the launch. And then for us, it was very nice because when you're in the balloon, you know that everything's okay. But for the people on the ground, it wasn't so good because what happened then was, you know the channel, and you look down the channel, and the balloon went right down the Catalina Channel, going south towards San Diego out over the ocean. And the balloon, you have this little silver ball, and it gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And finally, it just vanishes. And the people on the ground who you have left behind, who thought you were going to be flying across the Los Angeles basin and they could follow you with a truck, suddenly find that you have gone out to sea and have disappeared. And at that time, we didn't have a lot of satellite communications, so we found out when you're 50 miles out to sea and you find out your radio has a 40-mile range, then you can only talk to the porpoises and the whales and and they don't talk back to you. So we were out there in the ocean, and we sailed down. One of the other things you notice when you're floating south, you notice that the coastline of the United States is not north-south. As you go south, the coastline is going east. And so you suddenly find that you are very far away from absolutely everything. And then the sun goes down, it gets dark. It's kind of nice. There's a lot of sky and stars. And there's a kind of a little light out there in the horizon in the east where you say, oh yeah, well, that's probably Oceanside or some such place. But anyway, eventually around midnight, we came in over the harbor in San Diego, and we called Lindbergh Field. And we announced ourselves. We were November 200 Lima Alpha, which was the name of the balloon. And we said we were at this position. And he was very upset with us because he thought this was some kind of gag that some jokester was on the radio pretending to be an airplane. And we said, no, take a look. We have our transponder on. We're the ones who are going 3 knots over the bay. Well, there weren't too many airplanes going 3 knots, so he admitted that perhaps this really was us. And he called home and reported that we were alive and well, at which point we disappeared again and vanished and spent the night flying over Baja California, which is interesting. You fly very low and you hear these airplanes that don't have any lights on and that aren't supposed to be there, that are also not registered, zipping by. And in the morning, we were over the Sea of Cortez and ended up, we saw an airplane flying over 30,000 feet, so we called him up on the emergency. And he again thought we were just a jokester. We explained who we were, and would he mind calling home and telling him that we were alive and well and we were over the Sea of Cortez? And he said, yeah, I can do that. So he did, and that's how we were able to communicate. You know, these days it's all done by satellite and it's all easy, but it wasn't long ago when you had to take best advantage of the communication you had. And then we flew north and we ended up just coming across the fence back into Arizona, and we landed and made a beautiful landing. But what we didn't know is that we had landed in the Barrel Cactus National Monument, where it is illegal, absolutely illegal to land airplanes. So we had come down with a guide rope, and the guide rope had left a trail maybe an inch deep and an inch across for maybe a quarter of a mile. And after we landed and we were safe and we'd flown all day and all night and the next day and we made this great flight we're having, we see a guy with a broom going along and sweeping this terrible mark that we had left in this pristine desert. And then we explained who it is. So it was okay. But when our chase crew came to load the balloon into the truck, they got a ticket. Not allowed to drive off the road in the national park. Remember that, that's important. This is early going in that flight. I just wanted to show you a couple of pictures of what Palos Verdes looked like. This is from an airplane that happened to be coming by, and then we went out over the coast. The beauty of this is you try to fly low. So we were at this point maybe 500-600 feet off the deck, so maybe 800-foot MSL above sea level. When we were cruising down, we stayed below 1,000 feet. But when you get to after San Diego and you start going over Baja, then you've got some serious hills. And so we had to go up to about 5,500 feet or so to clear everything, and then back down on the other side and up. So the idea of a superpressure balloon is to stay low. It's not to, unlike when you're doing the transatlantic, you want to go to 40,000 feet. This is all shirt sleeves, wicker baskets, low altitude. And this is what it looks like as you're flying along. The famous sandbag over there that Eric filled, which was very useful, looking down, smiling again, not really understanding the problem, looking back at some of the scenery. And here's what it looks like as you start to go off the coast. So you can see it's all very, very low altitude stuff. After that flight, we decided to go back to the hangar where we had come to grief in earlier times and make some tests. And this is what the balloon looks like inside. One of the things you learn when you inflate a balloon inside a very large hangar at El Toro, I'll give you this information, write it down, it's very important because one day this circumstance may occur to you. Never open both doors on both ends at the same time. One door, it's okay. You open both doors, all of a sudden you have a wind tunnel and the balloons are ejected. So we always had to, when we had one door open, we had to put a sign on the other side saying, do not open this door. And they didn't. And you can see now we've gone to a little different high-tech gondola made out of Kevlar and aluminum. And you can again see the shiny nature of the balloon. This is what it looks like inside. So we had our radios, our technical equipment. We made some air quality measurements on that flight and all of our maps and data and whatever. So it's a nice, handy way to fly. And the beauty of the superpressure is there's very little to do because it just kind of floats along. It's very quiet. There's no burner. There's nothing happening, so it's absolutely still. Here's a picture. We made a flight out of Gaviota Beach, about halfway between here and Santa Barbara. And I'll just show you a couple of pictures of the inflation and launch. There's the trestle at Gaviota. This is what it looked like. We had a Coast Guard cutter that was escorting us, and this was a flight to make measurements of air pollution from a potential oil refinery. They were going to build an oil refinery up there, and they wanted to see if there was an oil refinery built in this area where the air currents would take the pollution and how much pollution would be. So we had measurements on board, and we were supposed to, again, fly low at the same altitude that the pollution from that plant would go and see where it ended up. And the Coast Guard was interested in that, so they provided a Coast Guard cutter to escort us. And these pictures, so I'll show you some pictures of us looking down and the Coast Guard cutter looking up so you get a feel for how things look. There's the balloon completely inflated again, as seen from the water. And here we are. So we take off, and we are flying low, and we've got a guide rope floating along in the water. So this is a floatable piece of heavy-duty rope, and you see from the balloon, it looks like this. So there's the rope going out, there's the ship, and here's from the ship. So that was the entire experimental arrangement. We have a Coast Guard cutter, and we have a balloon, and then we follow the trajectory. Now, the first thing you find out as you're flying out there is that the rule is that the balloon will always head for the largest oil rig in the area. We don't know why that is. It's just all this ocean, why it would head for an oil, but it does. And so the Coast Guard cutter, actually, we asked them to grab a hold of the line and pull us a little bit to the side so we wouldn't actually be running right over the rig, which helped. Then you'll find that also when you're out there, little birdies like to come in and land on the ropes, which I guess, in the ancient days this would be good because you'd eat them, but we didn't do that. We didn't catch them. But this is what it looks like from the balloon, and this is what it looks like, of course, from the boat. There's the shadow of the balloon. And of course, what's interesting is when you're in the balloon, you see a lot of wildlife that's along next to the Coast Guard cutter, which they couldn't see because we're in the boat. You don't see what's going on. But we could point out all kind of things that were going on to them, and they were always surprised to see that we had a much better understanding of what was going around the cutter than they did, and they've been doing it for 35 years. Kind of hot up there. We had to do a little improvisation of hats and keep the sun off. Here's some of our gear bags here. Then when we wanted to land, what we decided to do was have the Coast Guard cutter kind of winch us down. So the Coast Guard cutter grabbed the rope here, and we slowly came down to the beach because we wanted to make a landing right here on the beach without hitting any of these power lines or coming down on any of these houses. So we used the Coast Guard. I think maybe it was the first time it was done in maybe 100 years. I think they did this before in Europe, in the Mediterranean, about 150 years earlier, but nobody had ever done it here. So we thought we would try it and see if it worked. And here we are coming down. We decided we wanted to land right here, and you can see the problem is we don't want to get it. Once you're over here, then you're stuck because you can't get back, and there's no place to land. And then coming down, and there we are. So, as usual, from nowhere, suddenly a bunch of people appear, and we say, oh, help grab the rope and get us down, and it's always a kind of a nice party. And then the people who come, they say, well, where did you come from? And we say, Gaviota. And say, well, where are you flying to? And, of course, the answer is here, which always makes you feel, they say, gee, how did you do that? That's just amazing. But it works. So we were down and safe on this one. The next thing we did then was we decided if we could fly ourselves, then we could have a pretty good time by flying a lot of other people, and then we could have a balloon race. And we decided to do that at the Queen Mary in Long Beach. And this was called the Gordon Bennett Balloon Race. We started out in 1979 with a trophy. This is a bronze. This is a little edge of the bronze trophy designed and built by Paul Conrad from the LA Times. And these are a couple of the balloons that were involved in that. This is what a balloon race looks like. Now, again, we assumed we knew how to do this. We'd never done it before. Nobody in America had done it in the last 75 years. So, even at the Senior Citizens Club among the balloonists, there weren't a lot of people around who knew how to do it. But we decided we would wing it, and it would work out okay. We got the people from the Queen Mary to think that it was a good idea to launch a bunch of balloons in their parking lot, which required them to take down a lot of poles, light poles, and stanchions, and all kind of things to make room, but also made for a beautiful view of the balloons and the ship. And the balloons came from all over the world. We had American balloons like this. We had balloons from England, from Germany, from Austria. They came from everywhere for the opportunity to fly across Los Angeles and fly out into the desert and see how far they could go. Here's inflating. Again, we use helium in the United States. This would all be hydrogen if it was done in Europe. There's a French balloon, a Polish balloon, the Brits. So the balloons were coming from absolutely everywhere. None of these are pressurized balloons. These are all normal. This was a standard. So these are your classical gas balloons, the kind you'd see for the last 100 years, wherever. They were not hot air balloons. They don't have burners, but they're classical gas balloon, normal gas balloons. So they all have evacuation tubes down below. So they all run at zero superpressure. And this is what it looks like from the ship. So again, putting together the balloons, clearing out this area, and trying to launch the balloons over the water, but hopefully not into the water, which didn't always turn out to be the case. We had some hot air balloons that were tethered. So here's a hot air balloon doing a little advertising. Here's the Austrian balloon. A lot of sandbags. When you work with the gas balloons, then you've got a collection of sandbags that's impressive, because each one of these requires about a ton of sand to hold it down and get it inflated properly. And on this particular launch, we had 19 balloons. So there was a lot of action, a lot of sand that had to be put into bags. Dr. George, again, helping out doing the weather, which was important because you're flying across the LA basin, you'd really like to know where all these balloons are going to go. And it turned out, of course, that there's another rule, that when you're out on the ocean, the balloons always head directly for the largest oil derrick. When you're on the land, the balloons always head for the largest airport. And indeed, all these balloons headed right for Los Angeles Airport, and we had to coordinate the crossing of the balloons across the flight path of the airport with all the airplanes that were coming in, which turned out to be an interesting process. A couple of launches. So you balance off the balloon very carefully with the sandbags. You have a few people standing around, putting their hands on, putting their hands off, weighing the balloon off very carefully. And the Europeans do this extremely well because they have enormous experience. And so when the Europeans finally get their balloon perfectly into equilibrium and then take one sandbag off, the balloon just ascends beautifully because they've been doing this for a couple hundred years. So there's a Swiss balloon, there's the Austrian balloon, there's the British balloon. Again, everybody who has done this from Europe knows how to do it. And we had, as expected, some beautiful pictures of you see here all those sandbags that are used to get the balloon up, and then those sandbags are left behind when the balloon finally flies away. However, then there are the American balloons. The American balloons have a little less experience. And so you say, well, gee, how come after you launch, you're looking down at the American gondola instead of up? Because normally if you launch a balloon, it goes up. Not always. If you launch with a little bit less lift than you think, then, of course, the balloon is going to go the other way. And you remember that we were launching right from the side of the quay there at the Queen Mary. And so if you launch heavy, you can see where this balloon is going to end up. And so it turned into a boat for a while and cruised very nicely across the bay while they were frantically trying to get rid of some of these sandbags. And finally did lift off, pouring water off the side to the great amusement of the Europeans, who, of course, didn't do it exactly that way. And so you can see eventually this is the same balloon, eventually with water pouring down and boats following it, it managed to take off. Now the balloons flew quite a ways. The winning balloon ended up in Wyoming. There were balloons in Colorado. A lot of the balloons came down in the California desert, but the ones that really made it flew over 1,000 miles. Why did they come down? Well, they come down eventually because when you fly a zero pressure balloon, your fuel is your ballast. And when you run out of ballast, then you got nothing left to keep, because you're constantly losing gas. You make up for losing gas by throwing out ballast to keep in equilibrium. When you run out of sand, you got nothing more to throw out, and the balloon is going to come down. So, and you're losing gas because the balloon tends to leak, and every time the balloon is going up, as a little thermal, if there's a change in the temperature of the gas, for instance, the gas is going to heat up. It's going to force some of the gas out. When the gas then cools, it's going to contract, which is going to make the balloon fall. In order to make up for the contraction of the gas, you have to throw out sand. So you're constantly in a position of fighting instability of thermals and of temperature by throwing out ballast, which is what the superpressure balloon doesn't do, because the superpressure balloon is just floating there, doesn't care about all those things. But this is a matter of constantly fighting instabilities in the atmosphere by throwing out ballast, which means that the balloon is flying higher and higher because it gets lighter and lighter. And eventually you run out of ballast, and you've got to keep a couple of bags of ballast for your landing. So when you get to the point where you're down to your landing reserve, you open the valve at the top a little bit, brings the balloon down slowly, and then you make a landing on your guide rope. Now, most of the balloons were classical balloons like this. They had a net, they had an envelope, they had an escape valve here, which is, as you see here, it's closed off on the ground, but before they launch, they open it up, so this is just open to allow the excess gas to come out, and they had a classical gondola. But the Americans, Anderson and Abruzzo, who had since, before this, done the successful transatlantic flight, flew in a plastic balloon like this. So this was the first time a plastic balloon had been brought to this kind of a competition. And there they are launching, and they won. It was a lighter balloon. Since it has lighter structure, it could carry more ballast. If it carries more ballast, it's like more fuel. And so they were able to fly further, and they won the race. And that was the last, it was the last time that they flew together in a balloon flight before each one of them were killed in other kinds of accidents. One in a balloon and one in an aircraft. So that was their last flight together. So this is kind of the spirit that we had in bringing everybody together, and a lot of Palos Verdes people here, Alberta Samuelson, just the crowd of people. This is the Swiss balloon launching, and just gives you sort of an idea of the spirit and the atmosphere and how people enjoyed ballooning, enjoyed the camaraderie of bringing everybody together. And subsequently, of course, once we fly and then we land, there has to be a survivors banquet. And in this particular case, we had the survivors banquet at the Queen Mary, and we had about 500 people there, and gave awards out to everybody who had flown, because everybody gets an award for something or other, but particularly the winners who got the trophy that was put together by Paul Conrad. And the Conrad Trophy was a perpetual trophy that was given every year to the winner of the competition. We did it in 1979 at the Queen Mary, Then we were down at Mile Square Park in Orange County in Fountain Valley in 1980, 81, and 82. And then we went to Palm Springs. So we ran the race up till 1989 in Palm Springs, and then it's been run in Europe ever since. So the race has been a great success. It helped the rebirth of ballooning because gas ballooning hadn't gone anywhere in the United States in a long time. There have been a lot of ballooning done in Europe, but in America, gas ballooning had been dormant since the 1920s or so. And so by able to get this race back, new balloons were being built, new people trained, and so we had a whole new generation of gas balloonists who were brought into the sport as a result of the race. A lot of the Palos Verdes people contributed to this. What was my ballooning experience before the superpressure flights, and are they still using them today? The experience was in research superpressure balloons. We had built several hundred superpressure balloons for instrument, just to carry instruments and to fly them, and we made a lot of round-the-world flights. The record flight at that time was well over a year for Mylar balloons carrying small payloads, and we have been doing that since the early 60s. And are they still doing that today? The answer is yes. There are still, and now very large, very high-altitude superpressure balloons that are flying that don't carry people, but that are carrying ever-increasing masses of scientific instruments. So it's become a vehicle for flying long-duration, long-distance scientific payloads. It's also of great interest for planetary exploration. And the Venus balloons that flew and that made early measurements on Venus were also superpressure balloons built by the Russians. So it still goes on to this day, and I think has a future. Though we had thought that was the right answer for very long distance manned balloons, like the transatlantic job or the round the world job, because we knew that if you got it right and you could put the balloon up, it would fly forever. Now, it turned out that, though that's true, that's not the way it was finally done, that the round-the-world flights that were successfully done were combinations of hot air balloons and classical gas balloons, where the materials were improved to the point where the instabilities that we talked about were minimized, and it took less propane to do it, and they were able to get all the way around on one load of propane, which we thought at that time was not possible. So there was an alternative technology that was used to complete the successful transatlantic and round-the-world flights. The pressurized balloon was a sandwich. The inside was a woven Kevlar structure. So it was like a Kevlar cloth. If you looked at it, it was just regular cloth. It was a yellow Kevlar cloth. To that, we glued a double layer of Mylar. So the Mylar was holding in the gas. The Kevlar gave you the strength. The Mylar kept in the gas. And then the outer layer of Mylar was aluminized in order to reflect the sun. So the idea was to control the temperature variations by having the aluminized Mylar, control the gas leak by having a double Mylar coating, and control the pressure by having the Kevlar. So the problem there was you had to weave the Kevlar, you had to glue the Mylar on, so you had to make the basic cloth material. Then you had to cut gores out of that, and then you had to glue the gores together with tape, and the tape was made out of the same material, and the tape was laid on inside and out of the balloon. So it was a very tricky assembly process to get everything exactly right, and since it was super pressurized and Kevlar doesn't have a lot of stretch, you had to get the dimensions just perfect. And by going to super pressure, the balloon is always at the same shape and the same volume, and therefore it isn't losing any gas. So you try to operate it, you want to operate at the highest level you can to take care of all the variability without getting into the position where you're starting to overstress the envelope, because if it explodes, you're going to have a bad day. And we did run some tests of small balloons, of 3.5-meter balloons, where we inflated them to explosion, and we broke windows in the neighborhood. So when it goes, it's bad. The Atmosat balloon was funded as a research project by the Aerospace Corporation because they were interested in funding this for atmospheric research. And we had some cooperative arrangements between the Aerospace Corporation and the Air Quality District, and the Air Resources Board, and the EPA to see whether we could use this as a platform for making measurements. And the only one I mentioned was the one we did at Gaviota, but we did a series of other flights over the basin to make pollution measurements, and wrote a lot of scientific reports and did a bunch of things that were interesting but less fun. In the superpressure balloon, you don't go up and down a lot because it tends to stabilize. I've made flights in normal balloons. We did make some flights in Texas when there were a lot of thermals, when the balloon is going up and down like crazy, and the altimeter is pinning up and down, and you look up and the balloon's kind of flattened like a pancake, and then your comfort level is less. But in the superpressure, you really feel very, very stable. Everything's going along very nicely. There's very little to do. So the superpressure balloon tends to take all that instability out of the flight. So a superpressure balloon flying on a floating guide rope is about as stable as you could want anything to be. And you can just go to sleep and forget about it, and next morning you'll wake up and you'll be just, somewhere out there. The hot air balloon is extremely noisy. The gas balloon, of course, has no burner, and the superpressure balloon, which has no vent, there's absolutely nothing going on. So when you're flying along, for instance, at night over the ocean, it's just absolute. You only hear your heartbeat. There's just nothing whatever going on. And if there's any kind of wildlife, any birds or anything splashing out, you can hear forever. And it is the quietest thing that you can imagine, to be in this superpressure balloon, particularly at night, flying along over the ocean. Or we made some flights over New Mexico where there's nothing going on. So we didn't have a lot of fancy instruments, and so we sort of just watched what was going on. But what you can hear, we made a flight in Austria on a gas balloon and had a train going under us under the fog, and you could hear the train coming from miles away, and nobody knew you were coming. We flew with a gas balloon with the Atmosat out over the desert here in California, and came across some people riding horses, and we sort of passed them by, and they didn't even know we were there. It just turned out that the superpressure balloon was not the way to do it. There are three kinds of balloons basically you can use. You can use a gas balloon, you can use a hot air balloon, or you use a superpressure balloon, which is a gas balloon that's pressurized. And what people did was they combined the classical gas balloon with the hot air balloon, so they were able to extend the life of the propane by using the helium inside the balloon, and get the extra control that you needed so you wouldn't go up and down by using the hot air. And that combination turned out to be a better solution to the problem. And so all of the round-the-world flights used combinations of zero-pressure gas balloons and with a hot air propane-driven supplement. And that was the technology that ended up doing the job very well. And it gave them the great advantage that they were able to vary their altitude. Whereas with the superpressure, you want to go to one altitude and you want to stay there. If you want to do the round-the-world flight, you'd like to find the wind that's going in the right direction, which means having ability to move up and down is better. So they had a superior technology. Paris, California was, at that time, still is a major center for hot air ballooning. And so anybody's interested in hot air ballooning, yourself or your kids or your grandkids or whatever, go out there and make a flight. It's well worth it.
And then it's beautiful in Albuquerque,
right. And they're also now flying in Albuquerque. They just did that last week. Now, Albuquerque is, of course, a much bigger deal. In Albuquerque, they have something like 1,000 balloons that come together, and they're flying every day. In Paris, when we were out there, typically you'd have 10 or 15. But if you wanted to ride, that'd be the place to go. And you give them a call. They've got a lot of websites. So I just wanted to finish off sort of on the way the balloon race went afterwards, that this became very international, that there were a lot of balloon flights then that were made all over the world, particularly in Europe. In the very first race that we had in 1979, we had competitors even from Japan who came. So this was something that we thought contributed a lot to the rebirth of ballooning in the United States, and it was the volunteers from Palos Verdes who did this, who made it possible, that gave us the people, the personnel, and the expertise necessary to do it, and also that convinced us that knowing nothing didn't matter, that if we were enthusiastic enough, we could make it happen. And though that wasn't true in the case of the Forbes Transatlantic, it turned out to be true in the case of the Gordon Bennett, where we were successfully able to fly every year from 1979 to 1989, and we put a lot of balloons in the air, and we brought everybody back alive, and we were very happy to do it.
We're here in Tom's office with some memorabilia that he wasn't able to bring to the lecture. Tom, can you tell us a little bit about some of the memorabilia you have on the wall here?
Well, maybe we'll look at a few of these things in chronological order, following kind of the sequence that I used in the talk today. This is the Atlantic project, the Malcolm Forbes project. Here's a picture that describes something I talked about when my son Eric came over and said, "Can we go to Paris anyway?" This was this scene, and of course we had to go to Paris, so there was an added expense for the project. But in back here, you see Malcolm Forbes with his parachute, with his hands separated by that much, and you can imagine that he's saying something like, this was really close. And behind them is Bobby, who did a fabulous movie of the entire project. Here are the balloons. Here's how the balloon went up. And these are just clippings from all over the world in German and French and Japanese and what have you on how the project went. This is the preparation at the very last minute of the gondola. Here are the balloons. And we even did some training in a large emergency water tank to simulate some kind of going down in the middle of the ocean. We did parachute training, we did water training, and we did hypoxia training in a high-altitude simulator. So we had done a lot of work and prepared for everything, even as it turned out how things went wrong. Here are a couple of shots of one of the Atmosat flights. This is the flight here that was published that we talked about this morning out of the airship hangar in Tustin. And we flew balloon mail on all of the flights, and the balloon mail is always a popular thing, and it was distributed to people who were interested in it all over the world. The patch from the program, and shots of my son Eric at that time checking out the balloon and making his first flight. So we had a lot of fun in flying this and doing air pollution measurements over about 5 years. And above that is one of the early articles of the Gordon Bennett balloon race, and you can see on the left is a picture of Pete Neuschel and me in the Atmosat gondola with a number of shots on the right of the early Gordon Bennett trophy and balloons at the top, and again the Atmosat flying off the Queen Mary at the bottom. It received a lot of publicity at the time. We were in a lot of magazines and articles internationally, and that's how we were able to develop the international interest and get all of the international balloons here. Now, another interesting aspect of the Atmosat flights is that we said this morning that we had set a number of records, national and international records, but at the time, the superpressure balloon was not recognized as a unique kind of flying machine. And so it took a number of years for the International Aeronautical Federation to craft new rules for superpressure balloon flying and superpressure balloon records. And that caused a lot of consternation and confusion, but we have a number of records on the wall that attest to that process. The first certificate is issued by the National Aeronautic Association for a national record for superpressure balloons of a certain size category, in this case AS4, which was the size of our balloon. And it was a flight that we made from San Angelo, Texas, up into Kansas on the 18th and 19th of April in 1976. And we went about 900 and some odd kilometers, flew overnight, landed a balloon in Kansas, which was always kind of very folklorish, and we were happy to get that record. The next one is a record that we have, which you can see it says A4 instead of AS4. And so this was a record that was awarded before they created the AS category. So once they had created the AS category, then all those records had to be recertified. So we were in an interesting situation that we were setting records for a category of flying machine that actually didn't exist according to the Aeronautical Federation, the International Aeronautical Federation, and the NAA. And they had to go back and readjust all of these records to create this new category. So we were happy not only to set records, but to create a brand new category of flying machine. The third one is a duration record for the flight from San Angelo, Texas, which was a flight of 31 hours and 44 minutes. So typically our early Atmosat flights were about a day and a half, between 30 and 32 hours. It gave us an opportunity to fly the balloon during the first day, fly it overnight, fly it the second day, and then land the second afternoon. Gave us a good experimental rundown of how the balloon would operate day and night. The fourth one, here is a flight, a duration record. It was one of our Rancho Palos Verdes flights, and this was a 200th anniversary flight. We flew it on the 2nd to 4th of July, 1976, and as it says, we flew 32 hours and 30 minutes flying from Rancho Palos Verdes to Death Valley. We flew out over the water. We came in, flew over the entire Los Angeles basin, flew over Disneyland at night when they were firing fireworks off for the pre-4th of July celebrations. I went over the mountains in the morning and then through the deserts and crash-landed in Death Valley on the 4th of July. Try to find a rescue system on the 4th of July, 1976 in Death Valley. You've got your work cut out for you. The poster is a poster done by Paul Conrad, who did the trophy and a lot of our posters for the Gordon Bennett balloon race in 1981. And it has kind of a cartoon of myself holding a cluster of balloons, which are all the international balloons that were coming for that particular race. This was our race in Fountain Valley, where a lot of the balloons ended up in Mexico, and some of them then flew out of Mexico and went to Arizona and then landed in the Midwest. This is a poster that was done by the Maxie Anderson Ben Abruzzo Museum in Albuquerque, New Mexico, in commemoration of the last flight that they made together in that plastic balloon that you see in the center. And it's a number of artists' views of the different balloons, of the flight from the Queen Mary, of the flight of the winning balloon across the countryside, and little inserts of Ben and Maxie, both of whom afterwards died tragically. But this was a retrospective poster done by their Memorial Balloon Museum. One of the questions that came up in the talk is, what did you actually do for a living while all of this was going on? You're having all this fun. And the answer was, I started out in rocketry, and in a picture of Glenn and Carpenter and the launch gang and myself, and we were working on in an area that's now coming back into vogue, starting out on the Mercury Atlas program, which was the first manned orbital flight, working on the John Glenn rocket. Here's on the project at the Cape, and I was there for the launch, and after that kept going in the space and rocket business, and ended up at Aerospace Corporation, which sponsored the Atmosat balloon as a research project. So it was a nice opportunity to combine rocketry and ballooning and science and space technology with ballooning, which was a lot of fun. Today's talk was at Fred Hess Park, and Fred Hess enters into the story as well, because it was in late 1974, when he and I were both serving on the city council in Rolling Hills, that he made a presentation to me of a small balloon-like statue, which I still have, and the photo of his presentation to me on behalf of the council, wishing good luck for the soon-to-be ill-fated flight, is one of my treasured possessions. One of the fun connections this morning was showing our children at some of those flights, particularly Eric, who certainly remembers the Atmosat flight, and Eden, who remembers the flights that we made from Palos Verdes. Eric, who of course even remembers the windborne flight of Forbes. The kids kept on going in a similar spirit of adventure. Eric has 12,000 jumps now and is a world record holder as well. So we're kind of one of the few father-son teams that has national and world records. He's been flying with the Golden Knights for a long time and was recently the coach of the skydiving team at West Point. And Eden has had a career with the State Department, helping the government, and was recently posted in Tel Aviv and is now back home. We're very glad to have her back here. And these are some more pictures of Eric in both the West Point newspaper and the PV News, commemorating some of his skydiving adventures. This is a picture of the Golden Knights team in one of their formations as they are skydiving. The way it works in 8-way competition is you have 8 skydivers plus the cameraman who's taking these pictures. You have to make as many standard formations in a certain sequence as you possibly can in 30 seconds of free fall. So typically they start from 12 or 13,000 feet and they fall to about 2,500 or 3,000 feet. And in the time it takes to drop 2 miles, they have to do as many positions as possible. And they broke a world record by scoring a 32 in a official sanctioned world race. So that's a record that Eric holds to this day.
Thank you for watching Peninsula Senior Lecture Series. I'm Betty Wheaton. See you next time.